The daughter kicked her sick and elderly mother out of the house, not knowing she was hiding $2 million. The dry click of the doorknob turning was the only sound that shattered the silence. Then came the soft snap of the door, locking from the inside. Margaret didn't cry. The night's cold clung to her skin as if it wanted to tear away every layer of dignity she had left. In her hands were 2 suitcases, a blue one with wobbly wheels and an old leather trunk, its straps patched up by her own hands. They were heavy, not because of what was inside them, but because of everything they represented. Behind that newly closed door was her daughter, Sophia, 39 years old, a lawyer, married, mother to a 6-year-old boy, the daughter she had raised on her own. The daughter who, with a steady voice and a distant look in her eyes, had said, "I just can't do this anymore, Mom. It's over. You're going to have to leave." That was it. No shouting, no tears, not even one last embrace. Just that sentence, and the suitcases handed over as if they were nothing more than grocery bags. Margaret went down the 2 steps from the porch slowly, her knees crying out with arthritis. It was dark. The streets were almost deserted. The starless sky seemed to accompany her in its silence. The wheels of the blue suitcase scraped against the asphalt with a hollow, lonely sound. The houses on the block all seemed asleep. No lights on, no witnesses to this quiet departure. As she walked, the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and with each step, memories flooded in. She saw herself younger, hair tied back, stained apron on, washing clothes in a concrete trough after 12-hour cleaning shifts. She saw herself selling homemade cakes at school just to pay for Sophia's textbooks. She remembered pretending she'd already had dinner so there'd be more food left for her daughter. She recalled wearing worn-out shoes for years in order to buy her girl's first computer. The silent pride she felt watching Sophia get her diploma at graduation. Sitting in the back row, wearing the same dress she'd worn to 3 other parties, but with eyes fuller than her chest. Margaret never complained. She never asked for anything. She just loved. With that kind of love that doesn't parade itself, the love that simply does. The arthritis was a late-life reckoning for the hard path she'd walked. She'd been working as a custodian at a public school until 6 months ago. She applied for retirement not because she wanted to quit, but because she couldn't hold a broom anymore without unbearable pain stabbing through her wrists. Sophia believed she'd been fired. Never asked properly. Never cared enough to find out. And Margaret never corrected her. What good would it do? She passed the town square, where concrete benches sheltered silhouettes sleeping under tattered blankets. A lump formed in her throat, but she kept going. She had a destination, the public shelter for elderly women 4 blocks away. She didn't want a hotel, nor did she consider using the money nobody knew she had. 2 months earlier, an engineering firm had bought a plot of land she'd inherited from her grandmother. A piece of dry, forgotten ground that Margaret had maintained at great personal sacrifice for years, paying property taxes by pawning rings, selling household items, sometimes even going without medicine. She'd never thought about selling it, didn't know why, maybe out of attachment, maybe out of faith. Now that same plot that no one had valued was worth $2 million, a fortune, but she hadn't told a soul. Not even Sophia, certainly not her son-in-law. It was a secret guarded with the same fierce determination she'd used to hide her pain for all those years. The iron gate of the shelter creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the reception was a small office lit by fluorescent bulbs. A frail woman in a uniform eyed her suspiciously from behind a fogged pane of glass. "Full name?" she asked in a clipped tone. "Margaret Smith." The woman jotted it down without meeting her eyes. "ID and paperwork." Margaret handed over the documents. The clerk checked them, typed something into an ancient computer, then stood up. "Temporary bed. 3 days of observation. No guarantee of permanence." "I understand," Margaret replied with a slight nod. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. She was led to a shared room, 4 metal bunk beds, a small barred window, the smell of disinfectant and solitude. The other women looked at her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. She returned their gaze with a silent smile, genuine but not forced. She dropped her suitcases beside the bed and sat down slowly. The mattress was thin but serviceable. The window let in a sliver of streetlight, and through it Margaret saw a little bird land on the bars, small, restless, an unlikely visitor on such a cold night. She closed her eyes, no bitterness, no anger, only a profound silence and a single thought repeating like a prayer. Now I begin again. The white envelope arrived, folded in half, bearing the notary's seal and a blue stamped signature. Margaret took it in her calloused hands, sitting in the cramped kitchen of the old apartment. Sophia hadn't come home from work yet. Her grandson was asleep on the couch, his face buried in a thin children's pillow. She opened the envelope slowly, as if she already knew what was inside, but needed to see it with her own eyes. She read every line of the railroad company's contract. The purchase proposal for the land in the name of Margaret Smith was official. Amount, $2 million. Immediate payment, same-day transfer. She stayed there motionless, staring at that number with her breath caught in her throat. She counted coins to buy bread, yet there was that impossible sum, deposited without ceremony into the account that had always been empty. Not a snap, not a triumphant sound, just a quiet sigh. A sort of sadness that came alongside the certainty that this money would never be for showing off. On the counter beside the sink, a notebook covered in floral fabric lay open. It was her old recipe book, stained with grease and time. But between the recipe for baked rice and the minute bread, there were sketches of a project Margaret had been drafting for years. A shelter, a place where no one would need to explain why they arrived there. Just come in, sit down, eat, be treated like a human being. She already knew the name, Margaret's Table. The name wasn't vanity, it was a remembrance of the small round table where, for decades, she served meals that always seemed too meager, but were enough for two. Now in the shelter, seated on a plastic chair, Margaret watched the other women around her with attentive eyes. Each one carried an invisible story. Some spoke too loudly, as if shouting so they wouldn't disappear. Others barely opened their mouths. All of them wore that same look, the look of someone who had once been left behind. It wasn't long before she began to help. First, washing the dishes no one wanted to wash. Then, cooking in silence when the staff member didn't show up. One day, she brought a homemade spice mix that brought smiles at dinner. Little by little, the suspicious glances turned into nods, and the nods became whispered conversations, exchanges of stories, laughs muffled by the night. She listened more than she spoke. There was the sick woman whose children had taken all her belongings, another who lost everything in a fire, a third who had never had anyone. Stories told in fragments, like broken mirrors scattered on the floor. Margaret collected those fragments with the care of someone who knows the value of each shard. Meanwhile, quietly, she began to take action. Using a different name, she contacted a broker. She wanted a large, old property in a good location, something most would consider a burden, a ruin. She saw opportunity where others saw dust. The mansion appeared almost by accident, an early-century building, abandoned for years, windows boarded up, the gate overtaken by ivy. It was downtown, close to everything. Its structure was solid, despite peeling walls and cracked steps. When she saw it, her chest warmed. This was it. Here, the table would be set. Here, no one would ever have to eat alone again. She bought it in silence, transferred the funds without a sound, no celebration, no announcement, not even a walkthrough with the broker. Just the keys handed over in a manila envelope, along with the documents in the name of a shell company she'd created with the help of a retired accountant she'd met in the shelter. At night, lying on the metal bed in the shared room, Margaret smiled. The future was beginning to take shape quietly. She already knew the work would be long, that she'd face bureaucracy, suspicion, criticism. But she also knew how to wait, and above all, she knew how to do so much with so little. She always had. There, in that place of low voices and tired eyes, Margaret felt alive again, not because she had money, not because she had plans, but because for the first time in a long while, she wasn't a burden. She was a seed, and she had decided to bloom, even after being cut at the root. The mansion seemed to sigh when Margaret pushed the rusty gate open for the first time. There was something there that only she seemed to see, a space for rebirth and welcome, hidden beneath layers of dust and neglect. The ceiling was partially caved in, the wooden floorboards creaked under every step, and the smell of mildew hung in the air like a forgotten memory. But Margaret didn't see ruins, she saw promises. The purchase had been made in the name of an old acquaintance from the shelter, a retired and lonely accountant who accepted her request without many questions. In return, he gained something rare in life, trust. No one knew that Margaret was the real owner, and she preferred it that way. The project was bigger than she was. Within days, curious glances began from the neighborhood. An elderly woman peering through her window, a man walking his dog who would slow his pace as he passed. What was that place that was suddenly coming to life? Margaret hired a small crew, 3 men and 2 women, all sharing one thing in common. They had once slept on the street. She found them around the area, offering first a cup of hot coffee, then a job. She didn't want cheap labor. She wanted to give back something that had once been denied to her. Dignity. At first, there was skepticism. Some thought it was a scam. Others doubted the seriousness of such a simple lady with so many plans. But Margaret didn't explain herself. She simply showed up every day, early, carrying a basket of bread and an old notebook in which she wrote down everything. Gradually, doubt turned to respect, and respect turned to care. The workers began to call her Mrs. Margaret, with a deference that didn't come from any title. It came from the soul. The work was slow but alive. Every wall rebuilt was a step forward. Every pile of debris removed was a memory erased to make way for the new. The laborers, once head down, began sharing stories, smiling, tending to the mansion as if it were their own. At the center of the lot, Margaret had the kitchen built first. A large kitchen with an industrial stove, big tables, open shelves. She wanted it to be the heart of everything, the gathering point, just as it had been in her own home. Next came the dormitories, with simple but clean beds, white sheets, and large windows. The reading room got recycled bookshelves and donated books. And in the back, she planted a garden. Tomatoes, basil, boldo, and flowers. Always flowers. The name had been decided from the start. It was painted in soft letters on a wooden sign hanging at the entrance. Margaret's table. Everyone has a seat here. The phrase puzzled the first passers-by. Who was this Margaret? Why was the table hers? But you only had to step inside to understand. On opening day, there were no speeches, no photos, just a big pot of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and chairs arranged in a circle. The first to arrive was an elderly man with a long beard, tired eyes, and a shaky gait. He sat down without asking a thing. Margaret simply approached, filled a bowl, and handed it to him with both hands. He looked at her in silence, and she replied with a gentle, almost maternal smile. That was the first of many meals. Soon others came, entire families. Women with children, lost young people, forgotten elders. The rule was simple. There were no rules, no registration, no justification needed. You just had to walk in. You just had to be hungry for food, for conversation, for a place to belong. Margaret never introduced herself as the founder. She was just another person there, washing dishes, clearing plates, sweeping the floor. But there was something about her presence that organized everything effortlessly. The rhythm of the place followed the beat of her silence. Over time, Margaret's table became known, not for its building, which was still modest, but for what it stood for, a place where no one was treated like a social case, where there was no waiting list, just to be seen as a person. That night, sitting in the newly planted garden, Margaret watched the first guests settling into the dormitories. She heard the sound of a pot being washed by one of the workers who had stayed behind to help. She saw the reading room's light still on, where a woman flipped through a book of poetry. It was little, perhaps, but it was everything. She knew that many more would come to that table. She also knew that one day, when life called her to step aside, others would come to keep serving. Because what was born there was not just a shelter, it was a home, a place where no one ever had to apologize for simply existing. And Margaret, who had been silenced by the world for so long, now let her story speak through a hot bowl of soup, a clean bed, and a garden in bloom. The rent notice arrived with the amount crossed out in pen, an extra 300 reis. Sophia stared at the paper as if it were a death sentence. The bills were already piled up, some overdue. She tried calling the landlord, pleading, explaining, but he was blunt. Take it or leave it. The market's like this. She hung up without a word. Her throat burned, but pride wouldn't let her cry. She took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and went back into the living room, where her son was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a thin blanket, coughing in short bursts. Joseph, her husband, had come home late last night. There was a weight of failure on his face. He'd been laid off, one of the first workers the company let go during the cuts. He said he'd try something, anything, but the days went by, and nothing happened. No interviews, no hope. The apartment, once small but functional, now felt suffocating. Arguments became frequent, brief and curt. Joseph complained about the boys crying, the noise from the street, the food being the same every day. Sophia answered with silence or sarcasm. One random Sunday, he left to buy cigarettes and never came back. She stood at the door for hours, as if he might return any moment. But only the bills, the eviction notices, and the neighbors' whispers came back. Her son's illness worsened, persistent fever, a harsher cough. She took him to a free clinic. Mild pneumonia, they said, but treatment was expensive and she had nothing left. She tried a bank loan, denied. Tried friends, most didn't answer. The few who did said, "I'm sorry, can't help." Sophia clenched her teeth, bit her tongue, but refused to ask the one person who could really help her, her mother. Something in her preferred to sink rather than go back. She believed Margaret, now somewhere forgotten in the city, would have nothing to offer but judgments or reproaches, so she tried to manage alone. She turned to a loan shark, a soft-spoken man whose eyes never smiled. She signed papers without reading them. He handed over the money. She bought medicine, paid bills, but the interest came in a flood. A week later, the payment demand had already doubled, and she couldn't cover it. She was evicted on a rainy afternoon. There was no prior warning. Two men knocked on the door and told her to leave. She tried to argue, but they didn't negotiate. They just waited. She grabbed her son in her arms, packed his backpack with his clothes, grabbed a change of her own, and walked out. The streets felt wider than ever. The city's noise was a constant, irritating buzz. People hurried past her, dodging her unsteady steps. No one saw, no one heard. That night, she slept in a bus station. The boy shivered. He fought to keep his eyes open, but exhaustion overcame him. Sophia sat in a corner, sheltered from the wind, holding him tightly. She thought about asking for help, thought about screaming. But there was no voice left inside her. The next day, she went to a city shelter. It was full. She managed to get a spot on a thin mat on the floor. The food was meager, the feeling of abandonment, overwhelming. She spent days like that, wandering, searching for a place that wouldn't treat her like she was invisible. One night, with her son feverish again, she walked through downtown, looking for anything at all. That's when she saw the sign, lit by a soft yellow light, understated, above a warmly restored facade. The inscription read, "Margaret's table, everyone has a seat here." Sophia stopped. She read those words over and over. There was a strange, almost maternal warmth in them. Her legs trembled. She looked down at her son. He slept in her arms, utterly exhausted. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the smell of hot soup and fresh-baked bread greeted her. The walls were painted in gentle colors. An inexplicable calm permeated the space. Some people whispered quietly, others ate in silence. No one shouted, no one questioned. An elderly woman approached. Her eyes were tender but resolute. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her posture straight yet welcoming. She wore an apron stained with flour and smelled faintly of mint. Margaret looked at her daughter for a second that felt like an eternity. She recognized immediately the worn skin, the tearful eyes, the tight line of wounded pride. But she said nothing. Her heart pounded, but her lips stayed firm. "It's cold. Sit down," she said simply, gesturing toward a chair. Sophia hesitated. The boy stirred in her arms. Exhaustion won out. She sat. Margaret took a bowl, ladled out soup and set it in front of her. Then she brought a small spoon and a glass of water. Sophia said nothing. She didn't thank her. She just ate, silently, her gaze fixed on the table, unaware that she was being welcomed by the very woman she had once sent away, and Margaret, with her heart aflame, simply watched, as she always had, quietly, in love. The next morning, Sophia woke to the soft clatter of dishes being stacked and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Her son slept peacefully beside her, breathing easier, his face less pale. For the first time in weeks, she had slept on a clean mattress under a solid roof. The shelter was simple, but the quiet inside felt almost sacred. She got up slowly, still feeling the weight of exhaustion in her body. She stepped out of the dormitory door and saw the same woman in the apron, now arranging the tables in the dining hall with methodical calm. It was the woman from the night before, the one who had served her soup without asking any questions. For some reason, that woman made Sophia feel seen. Margaret noticed her presence but said nothing. She simply gave a small nod. Then she pointed toward a kettle. "Lemon verbena tea, I just brewed it," she said in a gentle voice. Sophia nodded silently. She sat down and drank. She looked around. The place was clean and airy, with small flower pots on the windowsills and cardboard signs on the walls that read, "Kindness is strength. Listen before you ask. Here, no one is alone." In the days that followed, she began to take part. First by washing the dishes she used, then by helping sweep the floor. Before long, she was assisting in the kitchen, learning to handle industrial-sized pots, oversized ladles, and homemade spices. She discovered there were volunteer shifts, nightly literacy classes, embroidery workshops, and discussion circles. Everything was organized but not rigid, as if each person could find their own pace to flourish. Sophia was surprised by how much it helped her. The weight she carried seemed to dissolve with every simple gesture, a smile when serving food, a sincere "thank you," a child hugging her for no reason. No one asked about anyone's past. There was only presence, outstretched hands, and calm gazes. The woman in the apron was always nearby. Margaret moved through the kitchen like someone dancing, her steps measured but confident. She never gave orders. She simply made suggestions, and everyone respected her as though she were the heart of the place. Sophia began to watch her more closely. There was something about the way she stood, the way she chopped vegetables, tended the flowers, knew everyone's name. A kind of care that felt from another time, a gesture her memory longed to reach but didn't know how. One cold afternoon, Margaret approached with a discreet smile and said, "I need help with the bread. This is an old recipe. I can't manage it alone." It was the first time she had asked her directly. The two of them stood side by side in the kitchen, kneading the still warm dough, dusting flour, testing its texture with their fingers. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was comfortable. At one point, Sophia observed how Margaret braided the dough, firm yet gentle. Suddenly, she remembered a scene from her childhood, her mother making bread on a Sunday, the radio playing, wearing that same floral apron. The memory came like a breeze, brief but enough to tighten her chest. That night, after serving the freshly baked bread, Sophia went to the reading room. She needed a few minutes alone. She wanted to understand why she felt so moved. She leafed through an old book when, between its pages, she found a letter. It had no sender, no date. It was a folded sheet with a steady, familiar handwriting. She read, "When silence surrounds us, sometimes it's because love is waiting for the right moment to be heard. I never wanted you to thank me, nor did I expect you to come back. I only hoped you'd have the chance to feel what it means to be welcomed without conditions, because a mother's love doesn't need to be acknowledged. It only needs to be felt, even if it's late." The paper trembled in her hands. She read it again and again. Tears filled her eyes before she even realized it. It was her mother's handwriting, the same she recognized from notes left on the table when she was a child. The handwriting that now told her everything, without shouting, without demanding. Sophia stood up, folded the letter carefully, and put it in her pocket. She left the room in silence. She passed through the kitchen, where Margaret was wiping down the counter, and looked at her with new eyes. She said nothing, only offered a gentle, deep smile. Margaret returned it with a tender look, as if she understood everything without words. That night, Sophia lay beside her son, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She still didn't know how to ask for forgiveness, but perhaps she didn't need to, because here, in this quiet, gesture-filled home, love didn't demand anything. It simply waited. Time passed like someone in no hurry, but carrying purpose. 2 years after that first bowl of soup served in silence, Sophia was a different person. Not just stronger or more serene. She was whole. The woman who once walked in, broken, now planted gardens with children and taught literacy classes to adults who were ashamed even to spell their own names. She had discovered that there was beauty in repeating small gestures, teaching someone to read their own name, cooking with herbs harvested from the backyard, embroidering dish towels alongside elderly women whose hands trembled but whose stories stood firm. Everything was simple. Everything was a seed. Margaret's table had grown, not in size, but in depth. It was common to see people arriving from the street, hungry, and staying for days, weeks, until they found the strength to start over. It was common to hear children who had never eaten at a real table ask, "Can I have just a little more?" It was common to hear laughter echoing in the dining hall, among the beds, in the hallways. Pain still existed, but now it had company. Margaret was still there, present in every corner, every detail. She still washed dishes, tended the garden, and sat to listen. But something in her steps had changed. She walked more slowly now. She breathed more carefully. Sophia noticed. Sometimes she offered her a cup of tea, a blanket, a moment to rest. Margaret always smiled and said, "I've already had more than I ever imagined having. Now I'm just harvesting." One morning, while they were picking mint from the garden, Margaret handed a manila envelope into Sophia's hands. Inside were the papers founding the centre and also the documents for the old plot of land, everything in Sophia's name. "This was never mine," Margaret said, her eyes shining but steady. "It belonged to everyone who ever felt forgotten, and you know what that feels like. Now it's your turn." Sophia was at a loss for words. She tried to refuse, to say she wasn't ready, but Margaret simply squeezed her hands and whispered, "You are. You always have been." Shortly after, Margaret fell ill. There was no commotion, no hospital, just a fatigue that grew and demanded silence. She spent most of her days in the garden, sitting in a wooden chair, watching the leaves sway and listening to voices in the distance. When she passed away, it was as she had lived, without noise. That morning, she didn't get up for breakfast. Sophia found her asleep, a book resting on her lap and a gentle smile on her lips. The funeral took place in the courtyard of the foundation. There wasn't enough space for everyone. Women arrived holding children, men with calloused hands, children running among the chairs. Young people who had learned to read there came. Elders who had found shelter when they had nothing left came. Each one carried a story. Each one carried a memory of Margaret. Sophia wore an old floral apron, the same one her mother had worn in the kitchen. In her hands, she held the last letter Margaret had left behind. She took a deep breath, climbed onto a low wall and read aloud, "I don't need you to ask forgiveness. I only want you to remember that love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits in silence for the right moment to bloom." She paused, looked at everyone. Then she smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears. "My mother left through a door that closed without a sound, but she opened many others, and she never asked for anything in return." The silence that followed was profound, full of meaning. There was no sadness, only gratitude, and in the air the scent of the herbs planted in the garden, mint, basil, rosemary, as if the garden itself understood. Margaret had gone, but she had left roots everywhere. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.